Good morning. Here's a tiny little blurb about Job. I know some of you are wanting to write on the book of Job, and I think that's great. And I think I'd be happy if everybody wrote on Job. It's probably the most complicated and sophisticated piece of writing we've seen so far. But if you are going to write on Job, it's imperative that you read chapter 8 in Gable. This is part of the three books in there called Wisdom Literature, which is it's as much secular in nature as it is religious. And one even wonders why this stuff got in there, because it's not specifically religious in nature. It has to do with secular culture. And it implies a late stage in the development of the culture. The sophistication of it and the way it's organized and the way it's accomplished implies both a writer who's capable of this kind of sophistication and an audience capable of reading it and understanding it. So it implies an educated audience who would understand, and therefore it implies a later development in the culture. This kind of material is not produced by a guy sitting by a campfire in the Sinai desert after he's tethered up his camels for the night. It just doesn't happen that way. This material is produced by a sophisticated culture, and that makes it fairly late. So, you can take my assertion that Job is a play, or you can leave it. Not that important to the material. But getting focused on what the point of the material is important. So let me talk to you briefly about the little clip I sent you of someone who shot 40 seconds of Monet's water lilies at the Orangerie in Paris. I think those are a monumental undertaking, and I never go to Paris without visiting that little museum if I don't do anything else. And I love to just sit there and look at those for a long time. But when you look at those, and the reason I chose this little amateur video, I don't even know who shot it, when you look at those, you know a couple of things. Number one, they're called water lilies, but you're not looking at a water lily. It's not a flower, it's paint on canvas. And then you get up close to, well, you know that. You know it's a representation, and then you get up close to the thing and you think, it doesn't even look like a water lily. It's just a blob of paint, and you have to establish the perspective of stepping back and seeing the thing in perspective. So I haven't lost my mind by giving you that. I wanted you to look at that by way of giving you this lesson. It's not a water lily, it's not the physical thing, nor is it even a particularly good representation of the thing. Like if I went to Monet's garden and took a picture of a water lily, that'd be a pretty good representation of the actual thing. This is not even a good representation of the actual thing. So what is it? Well, what those are, as in all Impressionist paintings, those are the attempt of an artist, and you decide whether it works or not, but the artist is attempting to create the impression of the moment in which he saw that flower, trying to represent the sunlight, the wind on the water, the sounds, the shades. He's trying to get an impression, which is an emotional thing, onto a flat piece of canvas without doing the impression itself much damage. So what you're looking at when you're looking at that water lily by Monet is not a water lily. It's paint on canvas. It's also not an accurate representation of a water lily. It's a record of Monet's feelings about the water lily and his impressions of it, and what was happening inside him and his ideas about the water lilies. Okay, you can like Impressionist art or not, but to take it literally and say, well, that doesn't look like a water lily, so it's a bad painting, is to miss the point entirely. So let me switch gears now I didn't lose my mind entirely by asking you to look at that. Let me switch gears now to the representation of the God in Job and the way a scholar approaches this. So you read that, the God at the beginning of Job is kind of bratty. He says, together with his adversary there, his opponent says, look, there's this guy Job down here. Let's mess with him. Let's screw with him. Except we can't make him physically. We can't hurt him physically. We can only just take things away and mess with his life. And then when that doesn't work, we come back in the second cycle and say, well, okay, this is still the God talking. Well, okay, that didn't work. So let's screw with the guy bodily. Let's make him hurt and see what he does. So Job is a lab rat to this God. And then at the end, you find you find the God being arrogant. Well, I'm so much bigger and tougher and meaner than you are, Job, and blah, 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 So the representation of the God in this material is not complementary. And if you read it with an open mind, just like looking at that water lily, you can say, wait a minute. If you're a believer, you say, wait a minute, that's not the God I believe in. That's not the God I understand. In the first place, it's not the actual thing, nor is it an accurate representation of the God I understand. So we come back to the whole subject-object thing that I nagged you about so much at the beginning because it was so incredibly important, and I need to visit it one more time. What you're looking at is not, and you know this if you ask the question. I say, that's not a water lily, it's a blob of paint. No, it's not even, and it doesn't even look like a water lily, so it's not even an accurate representation of the water lily. So what is it? It's an impression of Monet's feelings about the water lily. So the scholar approaches, well, that's not the God I believe in, and it's even not a good representation of the God I believe in. So what is it? It's an impression of the God from the writer of the material who was feeling that way about his God when he wrote that stuff. Okay? So it is not an objective. You can't say there's God any more than you can say there's a water lily. It is not the object. The painting of the water lily is not the object. The painting of the water lily is based upon the subject, Monet. The painting, let me stretch the metaphor a bit, the painting of the God in Job is not the God. It's not even a good representation of the God that a believer believes in. It's an impression of the feelings of the subject, the writer who wrote the thing. So to take that literally is, again, to be as misguided as if you took that blob of paint on that canvas as an actual water lily that you could walk up and pick it and smell it. All right. So the sophisticated believer says, wait, that's not the God I believe in. It's not even a good representation of the God I believe in. So what is it? It's an impression from the writer. It's a subjective impression from the writer. Okay? So what's this thing actually about? It's not about God. None of this wisdom material is about God. It's about people and their lives. So the focus of Job is not to talk about God, and so to say, well, it reinforces that God gives us things and God takes away things. Yeah, we know that. There's nothing to that. We accept that as a fact. If you're a believer, you accept that as a fact. You don't have to prove it. So what's it about? It's not about God at all. It's about Job and what Job goes through and the impressions that we're supposed to get. So what the book of Job is about is the problem of suffering. What causes suffering? What does a person do about it? Is it a naturally occurring phenomenon? Is it due to actions that I take? What is this situation of suffering, and how does a person deal with it? And importantly, and absolutely essentially, Job is innocent, and Job knows he's innocent. Job knows he doesn't deserve this. He's a good guy. In fact, if you read the footnotes at the front of Suggs, Job's like the perfect Israelite landholder. He's got the right number of sons and daughters. He's got the right proportion between sons and daughters. He's got the prescribed appropriate number of cattle and servants and so forth. In other words, Job is the stereotypical perfect guy. And Job never does anything wrong in this material. So you can't say Job is being punished for his sins, because he's not. Job is innocent, and he knows he's innocent. So the centralized subject here is, what is the nature of undeserved suffering? How does it happen? Where does it come from? And how do we redeem it? Those are the questions, and those are not questions of religion at all. Those are philosophical questions that don't have to be referred to religion to find answers. So I don't want to belabor the point, but if you're going to write on Job in this class, you're going to have to focus on this idea of undeserved suffering. The suffering that existential suffering that just is. It's not that I'm suffering because I did something bad and I'm being punished for it. No, that's not the thing that the literature is focusing on here, nor is the literature focusing on presenting this idealized vision of God. God's kind of a brat and kind of arrogant in this material. So that's not what we're supposed to focus on. What we're supposed to focus on is, here's a guy who's done nothing wrong, and he knows he's done nothing wrong, and yet he's being caused to suffer. And so there are various responses to this kind of existential, undeserved suffering without a cause. And that's the meditation that the play is supposed to produce. Like any good piece of theater, doesn't give you answers, it gives you things to think about when you leave the theater. Every piece of good drama or opera I've ever seen, when I leave the theater, the story's still going on up in my poor little empty head here, and I'm still working on solutions and working out details. It's very seldom, I don't think ever, that I've gotten, oh yeah, there's the answer in a play. But rather, here's the thing to think about and meditate about and see if I can find an answer in my own life. So I'd invite you to use that focus, remembering again, these three wisdom things have almost nothing to do with religion, which is why it's odd that they're in here. And we'll talk about later on why it's kind of odd that they're in there. And it's because the nation itself is suffering for reasons that it doesn't understand. And so their great writers write these things that are representations of this undeserved, uncaused suffering by way of offering comfort or a way out, or at least a way to manage this. So that's the deal with Job. And I'm sorry the little water lilies thing was the best I could think of to tell you, God is a background character in this play. So is the adversary. The bet between the adversary and the God is just the gimmick that gets the thing rolling. It's the interaction between Job's friends, who seem to want to say, well, what did you do to deserve this suffering? You must have done something to deserve this suffering. And Job's coming back time and time and time again, no, I did nothing to deserve this suffering. Those interactions, the actual acts of the play, are what's important. And the philosophical process, the thought process about this undeserved suffering is what we're supposed to think about. And they're in here because they reflect a certain period of Israel's history when they were suffering, and undeservedly so they thought, and they didn't know how to do anything about it. They didn't know how to handle it. And so, as in moments of great crisis, they often turn to their literature and their writers and their creative artists to deal with these complications, because sometimes great art provides an answer or can find a way to deal with complications when the regular mundane life can't. Okay, so that's the deal with Job. There will be some stuff in the forums this week to discuss further. The other two pieces that you might choose to write about, both Ruth, which is considerably less complicated but just as sophisticated, and then Song of Songs, which is even more sophisticated and more complicated. But they come at a particular time when the nation is questioning itself and questioning its relationships, and questioning its answers. The answers that have always worked are not working all of a sudden, and we don't have any new ones yet. So how do we think about that? How do we live with this not knowing the answers that have always worked? And that's the question behind all three of those basic, three things. Okay, that's all for now. I will get some stuff up for you. Probably it's 2:15 here. Maybe this afternoon, more likely tomorrow morning. But remember, get to work on those drafts and get ready for a draft exchange next week. All right, thanks, bye.